I'm Barbara Peters. Welcome to another episode of the Criminal Calendar. One of the great things about having had a mystery bookstore for 17 years is that I have gotten to travel all the way through their writing life with some authors. And today, Stephen White, you're one of them.
It's a pleasure to be here, Barbara.
Thank you. I can remember when you published your first book. I've learned today, since today you and I have already done a program where you were at ASU as their very first Poison Pen visiting fellow. That's so cool.
Got to pretend I was an academic again. It was nice.
It was nice, and I thought it was actually quite an honor from the university. I did reject your library privileges for you. I apologize for that.
I actually asked them to give me online library privileges, and I think they're going to do it.
Really?
As an academic, I never turned down access to a library.
Well, there's a lasting benefit that hadn't occurred to me.
There's a lasting benefit.
I'm so pleased. Well, go back and let's talk for a moment about privileged information.
Okay.
And you tell me again what you told me earlier today, because that was a fascinating story.
Privileged information was born along with my first attempt to enter the computer world. It was back in 1989 I bought my first computer. At the time I was a practicing psychologist in Boulder. And the computer was intended to help me write reports and to help me do the billing in my practice. And it was a very archaic machine that came with a computer programming software, word processing software called Write and Spell that I couldn't figure out how to use. And I decided in order to teach myself how to use the software, I'd write a story. And I had an idea for what I wanted to write based on some professional work I was doing, and I would go down to the basement and write for a couple of hours in the morning before I saw my first patient. 3, 4, 5, 6 months passed, and pretty soon I had a book.
So there you were, locked in a closet in your basement, using what, this like suitcase-sized machine?
This suitcase-sized machine and an old dot matrix printer, and the pages started piling up, and no one could have been more surprised than me that it turned out to be a book.
Was this in an era in which you were using floppy disks and no hard drive?
It was floppy disks. In those days, an entire book would take 4 or 5 floppies, and it would literally take an entire day to print one on the dot matrix printer. So yeah, it was a major investment in time.
I can see that it would be, but it's interesting that you got to start with a medium. I mean, even if it was primitive by today's standards in terms of computers, at least you got started writing in a thing that was where it was easy to move stuff around if things weren't working. Was that useful to you?
Yeah. Previously, I had written my dissertation. It was the longest document I'd ever written, and in those days, which was 2 to 3 years, 4 years perhaps before I started writing the book. No, I'm mislabeling. It was 15 years before, but I wrote that on a typewriter. And moving things required cut and paste. We used to literally cut things out and paste them onto blank pages in order to move passages. So the word processor was a revelation for me, and I just thought it was wonderful. And looking back on the idea of writing fiction without the ease that comes with word processing, I know there are still writers out there who do it and write longhand and write on typewriters, but I can't imagine it.
I ask you that because, I have to write a lot myself, not fiction, but I do tons of reviewing in other publications, and I find so often I really don't know where anything starts until I've written something, and then I find the beginning. And I think that's why, for years, I was always completely defeated by technology, that was so unforgiving, because you had to start all over again. I earned my own way through my second master's degree typing PhD dissertations.
God bless you, because somebody typed mine, and people have to be incredibly precise and meet university standards, and yeah, it was.
But you don't get to change your mind.
You do not change your mind.
And I find that the computer is just unbelievably freeing.
When I wrote Privileged Information, what I wrote first turned out to be, I think, chapter 7 in the book.
Aha.
And I had no way of knowing that, because in my mind, that was where the story started. But as things evolved, I added things that came before that. But, it would have been a disaster to try and do that in the old typewriter days, to move passages and start chopping things up. So, yeah.
Well, I really laughed when you were mentioning that about the computer, because my husband has like one of the first computers ever made, and it's this monster. It lives in a storage locker, and it looks like, you know, you need a whole room for it. And it's just astonishing how fast it's all evolved.
I was forced to get rid of mine. I considered it an antique at the time, and it was hard to part with it, but it's now gone.
So Privileged Information is a book that revolves around what?
Privileged Information, the idea for it came from a relatively esoteric psychology law problem called a Tarasov problem, which is the dilemma that therapists run into when they have a patient who is made an overt threat to hurt someone. And it's typically the primary exclusion, other than child abuse, to the privileged information confidentiality requirement that therapists have. So the book basically has to do with a therapist who gets himself into a Tarasov problem where he believes that a client is about to hurt someone, and he has to struggle with the legal and ethical implications of sharing that information.
You mean as in warning the potential victim?
As in warning the potential victim.
Can you spell this word? I'm not sure I understand. Tarasov?
Tarasov. It's the court case in Oakland, California that put this into law. It's T-A-R-A-S-O-F-F.
Okay, so it's a name.
It's a name.
Got it. I heard you use it earlier today, and I couldn't decide if it was Latin or, you know, what was I missing there?
No, Tarasov is a legal case, the precedent.
So it's sort of like Miranda, if
yes.
you're right. Okay, I got it. And you know, it's interesting because crime fiction, there are so many novels where that whole issue of confidentiality has applied. It works for priests and rabbis, works for lawyers, you know, psychologists, psychiatrists. I'm sure Jonathan Kellerman's used it. I know Father Brown used it. I mean, sorry, G.K. Chesterton used it, writing Father Brown.
There are certain professions that it becomes part of the everyday life of the professionals, whether it's a priest or a lawyer or a psychologist. And it becomes one of the variables that I can use as a storyteller in determining how a story is told and who can know certain information. One of the benefits is that the reader almost always gets to know the information. And from a storytelling point of view, that provides some true flexibility because the reader often knows things that some other characters in the books don't know.
Right.
And it provides a fun way to include the reader in the story and as an alternative way of handling the information.
You know, that's such a neat device. I remember what a revelation it was to me when somebody pointed out that the point of Dr. Watson in the Sherlock Holmes stories is because Holmes, you know, the genius, knows things and is superior to the ordinary reader. But Watson, who is deliberately written to be slightly stupider than the ordinary reader, allows the reader to feel superior to Watson and learn things, have things explained to him, and, you know, doesn't mind thus being inferior to Holmes. And I thought about that. That's a great device.
The device is important, and it's important to me in another reason, and that is that there's almost always information that needs to be imparted in a story, imparted to the reader in a story, that can be imparted in dry ways, or it can be imparted in ways that are dramatically richer. And what having the sidekick gives you is an opportunity for dialogue that moves the drama along and removes the necessity for exposition, which can really slow down the development of a plot. So I think whether it's, you know, trying to introduce a reader to a culture they're unfamiliar with, to science they're unfamiliar with, to a profession that has nuances they're unfamiliar with, by including a character who is also being introduced to those things, you gain all kinds of literary advantages.
Absolutely true. You also gain another narrative point of view.
Yes.
And you know, I mean, think about Nero, Wolfe, and Archie. Mm-hmm. That was set up in a way that Archie had to be the legs because Wolfe would never leave the brownstone.
Yes.
So you also can have people being in two different places at once, which can seriously improve your detecting opportunities.